today I'll talk about, which is, of course, I'm going to get into like this a little bit later period of ancient Mesopotamia. Of course, the history of Mesopotamia keeps going, after that, of course, into the Iron Age. But mostly going to talk about the rise of the Assyrian and Babylonian states that controlled Mesopotamia, which, by the way, were some of the last states that were considered what we call Semitic type kingdoms or empires that were in control of Mesopotamia, because after that, all these non-Semitic peoples kind of controlled it, Aryan European type peoples that come in, that we have it kind of occupy it, of course. But I'm going to get into first, and I'll talk about the first state that really comes in that we have that's well known, which you may have heard of, the Babylonians. I'll kind of talk about them first, like the old Babylonian state, which called different names. Traditionally, they either call it the first Babylonian Empire, or they'll also call it the old Babylonian Empire. Some people say paleo, like the term paleo, a Greek word meaning old. And this was a state that was around for about 2 centuries. So from about the 18th century to about the 16th century BC. This state was mostly controlled like southern part of Mesopotamia, which they called Babylonia later. And then eventually they take over all of Mesopotamia, which they do. And but they had their own name of it. You see on the bottom there, Mat Akkadi, I think was the common name that the Babylonians called it, which meant the country of Akkad. Because if you know about this particular state, it was mostly comprised of Akkadian peoples, Semitic peoples that had already taken over Mesopotamia before this. King Sargon, we talked about before, Sargon of Akkad. And so that's where kind of that name came from, that they called itself. And the term Babylonia, if you know about it, is derived from the capital of that empire, which is Babylon. Which Babylon, there's different interpretations of the name if you want to know it. Comes from this Akkadian word, which is Babylon, which has got different translations, but it means either the gate of the god or gods, if you want, or the door of the god. So it's one of the two, I guess, translations. So you guy was talking about that in that short little video at the beginning. And it's because of the Ishtar Gate, which you see in that image right there on the right, which was like the main gate into the city. But I think the gate may have not been built till later. Like Nebuchadnezzar, they say, actually built, the actual, gate itself. I'll kind of show you some other images. There's kind of an image of maybe what Babylon looks like later, at least by the time of Nebuchadnezzar II. That's maybe kind of what it could have looked like a long time ago. Babylon was built on the Euphrates River. It's about 60 miles south of Baghdad, to be about the location of it. And at one point, it was considered one of the largest cities. And I know by the time of Nebuchadnezzar, the population may have been about 200,000 people living there, which is the largest city probably in the world. This is 6th century BC later, of course. 2,200 acres in size may have been the ruins of where it was originally. And then you can see it may have been around close to three or 4 square miles, I think is what they estimate was the size of actual Babylon, the capital, which was also the capital of different empires. The one of Hammurabi, and we'll get to later, the one of Nebuchadnezzar, which were 2 separate Babylonian empires. Of course, you see King Hammurabi. Hammurabi, of course, is considered the greatest ruler, of course, of this old Babylonian state we're discussing in the Bronze Age. And he was one of like many kings. We consider him, he was the 6th king of the Babylonians. And you can see he reigned like early 18th century BC. And if you know about the old Babylonian Empire, it was actually reigned by a dynasty of rulers that were called Amorite. Amorites, you may have heard of them, were a type of Semitic people that originated from, they think, Canaan, like to the west, like close to Israel, maybe Syria. and they migrated into, I think, Syria. I think they controlled Syria at one point, like part of it, and then they came down and took over Babylon. And so all the rulers that ruled over this old Babylonian state were mostly descendants from Amorite peoples, Semitic peoples from Canaan. I think there were they think about 11 of them. 11 rulers was how many rulers, of course, reigned. But Hammurabi, you see there, of course, in that image, was the most famous king of the actual dynasty of rulers that controlled it. I've got some other images kind of showing you the actual map that they controlled, but they think Babylon went back to probably Sumerian times. They think it was like a small, like city state of the area of Sumer, and then over time it became independent. And then under Hammurabi, he took it and he made it into an empire, because before that it was like a small kingdom of some type that was ineffective. And so they think sometime in the early 18th century, he began conquering the territories around it, which included different areas. He took over Mari, which was up in the area of like the upper Euphrates and Syria, took over that. Part of Elam, which was a powerful state in southeastern Iran at the time. Sumer, he kind of absorbed that, and also Akkad, which was both south of Babylon. All that was combined into like one large-sized state, which he and his sons and grandsons kind of ruled over, of course, later. But of course, as you know, the thing that Hammurabi's very famous for is not his empire, not all his conquests and things like that, but the law codes that he was known for, that he created, of course, with this particular state, which you see there, the Code of Hammurabi, which you can see there. The Code of Hammurabi was a law code system that was developed in Babylonia. It wasn't the first one. I think we talked about before how the Sumerians under that guy named, that king I told you named Ur-Nammu, probably one of the most famous Sumerian kings, created that particular law code system about maybe the 21st century BC. But they think it was a major influence on, of course, that particular code that developed. So there was a legal code which eventually they had about 282 laws on. They think it had more than that, but they've only been able to translate about 282 from the actual stone pillar that was discovered. And just kind of some stats about the actual code itself. So 282 laws, of course, were inscribed on it that they've been able to translate, of course. Is inscribed on this stone pillar, which they call it a stele or a stela, I think is the term they use for a stone slab. And it was actually discovered in southern Iran, a city called Susa. It was found by French archaeologists in 1901, just recently, past century. And of course, if you know about it, it ended up in France. The archaeologists brought it back to France and all of that, and it ended up in the Louvre. It's where it ended up in, like in the Louvre Museum, of course, which you see on the left. So that's where it is today. And at the top of it, it's got this picture of what they think is Hammurabi and a god next to him, which they think is the god Shamash. Which Shamash, I think I told you, was a type of sun god that went back to Sumerian times, but it was also a god of justice as well. So I guess the Babylonians saw, God kind of like giving them like their laws, kind of like Moses receiving the 10 Commandments, maybe from their point of view about that. The laws are, by the way, very influential. They influence, the Old Testament, a lot of the different laws that go, like the Mosaic laws, 10 Commandments, things like that, were likely influenced by the Hammurabi Code. Also, they think other states were influenced by, like I know the Persian law code supposedly were influenced by it. They say like maybe even Roman laws and things like that may have been affected by it later as well. How did the law codes work? They worked on a principle called lex talionis, which means law of retaliation, which was a type of idea where it was like equal justice or reciprocal justice, where basically if somebody did something to you, you in return could do something to them within the law. So like you were injured or whatever, or something they took from you, you had a right to get it back or whatever. So that's the initial thing of how the codes work. In the Bible, there's a famous, you go read Exodus, of course, Exodus 21:24. They mention about the term eye for an eye, or they also say eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, foot for a foot, etc. And so that's the principle of lex talionis, or law of retaliation, of how the codes work. It's actually mentioned in the code, like law code number 196 does mention it, and I think there's another one where it mentions tooth for a tooth in another one as well. So those are things that it of course mentions. It was written in, by the way, Akkadian cuneiform. So that's the language it was written in. It has like something like almost 4,000 or so, close to 4,000 lines of cuneiform in the actual writing of the actual law codes themselves. I've got examples I'll kind of show you of some of the actual laws, which are right here. They're pretty strict. Like if you look at a lot of the Hammurabi Code, seems like most punishments were either you got fined for something that you did, you got something cut off, like your hand, your ear, or something, tongue got cut off, cut out, or a lot of them were death is another thing that happened as well. Code 195, you can see the son strikes his father, his hand shall be cut off. So you cut off your hands for hitting your father. 197, if he break another man's bone, his bone shall be broken. Let's see here. If a physician makes a large incision in the slave of a freedman and he kills him, he shall replace the slave with another slave. So you got that right there. If a slave says to his master, you are not my master, if they convict him, his master shall cut off his ear. So you got 196, eye for an eye. A tooth for a tooth is law number 200. So things like that, of course, are mentioned. And it might not be like they replace your tooth. It might just be you have to pay a fine or something in return for taking that guy's tooth out and things like that. And so that's basically the codes themselves. Under the codes, women had rights, believe it or not. They had right to divorce, you can see. They could own property, slaves, they can transact business. They could even give away inheritance. Like if they have property or something, they could give it away in a will, like if their husband has died, etc. So they had those kinds of rights that were actually in the code. However, you committed adultery, they put you to death if you're a woman. You wonder about that. Now, why they have the Hammurabi Code? Well, why was it developed? Probably to create justice and order throughout Hammurabi's empire. That's the main gist of probably why they created it. But it didn't just create stability, like say social wise or political. They say it also created a lot of economic stability as well, because it does go into economic things as well, not just dealing with like marriage, divorce, crimes, and things like that. We think of inheritance and stuff like that. You see a lot in a lot of law codes, but it talks about a lot of other things like economic aspects as well. Now here's a list of the kings they had, like that were after, they were really with Hammurabi and other ones there you see. They had a total of about 11 kings, although the first like 5 above Hammurabi weren't really effective much until he came to power, the first major ruler you can see. And then you can see one of his sons reigned, Samsu Ilani, I think was his name. And then you have a few others that reigned afterwards, but it's the empire is really not that great. Like, I guess he was the patriarch and the guy that kind of knew how to run it. And then after that, it kind of just fell apart within a short time. What happened to them? Yeah, they got overrun by different peoples. They think that they were sacked by two peoples. There was one, the Hittites, I'll talk about first. The Hittites are really more famous. They come in and they sack Babylon about 1595, roughly. And then they have this other people that come in called the Kassites, who are some kind of people in Iran that were living at that time of like the close to the Zagros Mountains region. They actually came in and took over Iraq, the southern part of it anyway, for about 400 years. They were the political vacuum, I guess, that kind of took over. But they weren't really that powerful compared to like the Assyrians later, or even the Neo or New Babylonian Empire state that'll form, ruled by mostly King Nebuchadnezzar II. Let me move on. I want to talk about next to a little bit about the Hittites, because I told you the Hittites came in and they sacked Mesopotamia, Babylon. I told you in the 590s. They didn't really occupy Mesopotamia much, except maybe the northern part of it, like close to Syria. But a little bit about the Hittites and who they were. The Hittites were a type of Indo-European people that they think came out of Eastern Europe. I think it's believed that Hittites may have gone back 4,000 years or more to maybe like the southern part of the Ukraine. Is about, I think, archaeologically where they think they may have come from. And then over time, over, I guess, so many centuries or whatever, they came down into what is modern, where modern Turkey is. The Republic of Turkey is where they eventually ruled. And they lived in an area that is called by, I think the ancient Greeks called it Anatolia, or we call it also Asia Minor, or also, of course, Republic of Turkey, which is right there as well. And they were called either the Hatti or they were called the Hattians. That's the common name that they call themselves. Now, I think the term Hittite is more like a term that was like seen in the Bible. Is basically it. Hittites are an interesting culture. They kind of bring on the Iron Age because the fact that they were one of the first major peoples to monopolize and mass produce like iron instruments, like for weaponry and I guess for agriculture or whatever. And that's kind of one of the things that they're very famous for. But they're only around for a few hundred years, Hittites. Like, I know they dominate for maybe 300-400 years the most. And then after that, they declined after the beginning of the Iron Age. Here's some other images. Here's a map kind of showing you where the Hittites were about located. They're mostly in that central part of Turkey was where they were. And then they did push down into close to where Syria and maybe part of Lebanon is today. You can say it went back to about, I told you, to the 18th century. It's maybe when they start settling in that area. And here's another map of it right there. So they ain't going back further than that, maybe to 2000 BC. But they did have a capital, which is spelled different ways. I think the common name, I'll get to the Hittite rulers in a second, but Hattusa is the common name they usually call the capital of the Hittite Empire. Hattusa or Hattusas, it's usually spelled either way. It's located in central northern Turkey, is where the ruins of it is today. And they think it had a large population of about 50,000 that actually lived there at one point. And it's about, you can see about 1 to 2 square miles in size. And it was later sacked about 1200 BC. So it's I think the capital of the Hittite Empire for a few hundred years overall. Those are some of the early rulers that reigned over the Hittites, at least in the kind of old Hittite Empire period. The two that are at, I guess, the second and third rulers you're looking at right there are probably the most famous rulers they had early on. Hattusila or Hattusilis, the first, is how they spell it, was considered really one of the first major rulers they had and he was the one they say that founded their capital. So Tusa becomes like the capital of the Hittite Empire in the 17th century BC. And then he had a grandson named Mursila or Mercilus the First, and he was the ruler that sacked Babylon in, like you see there, close to 1600 BC as well. A little about the Hittites militarily. They were masters at a lot of different things. You look at their military, they were great at making fortifications, mastering that. But they were great at also using like chariot warfare as well. And then, of course, I told you about the fact that they were like one of the first to begin mass producing iron weapons, which is true about that. And kind of shows some images, of course, of that right there. There's, of course, some Hittite iron you're looking at right there. They actually had these furnaces that they built to produce, the iron for their, war machine, and I guess to make different kinds of implements. And if you know about iron, early on they figured out that they could make iron implements from meteorites that had fallen from, outer space, which had a lot of iron in it. So initially they started making stuff like that way. And then, of course, they figured out they could mine for iron ore, which Turkey has a lot of mountains. And so that's something that they started doing. And they figured out, which took a long time, but almost 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit it took to actually melt the ore into, like a liquid type steel or iron to produce those weapons. And essentially, I guess it took them a while to figure that out, but that's something that the Hittites did. And at first, they tried to monopolize it, the actual, people that made iron under them. But over time, it spread to other peoples, and so other countries got iron and all that. And so after that, other states like Assyria and so on became more powerful. Hittites, if you study about them, they peaked about 13th century BC. The Hittites were fought for control of Syria, if you know about this, with Egypt, which was ruled by this king, by this pharaoh named Ramses the Great or Ramses the Second. And they actually fought a battle called the Battle of Kadesh, which was fought, I think, in kind of southern western Syria, is about where it is, about 1275 BC. And I think they say it was a draw between the two powers, like nobody won the battle, that kind of thing. But supposedly after the battle, there was some kind of peace treaty that was made between the Hittites and the Egyptians, and it was considered the first peace treaty in world history like ever signed. Now, I think the Hittites gave Ramses like one of their princesses for him to marry or something like that, was the story with that. Now, what happened to the Hittites? They got overrun by these people called the Sea Peoples. You may have heard about them, which the Sea Peoples were some kind of confederation of tribes that came out of the north, they think maybe in Europe, which had iron weapons, and they were seafaring peoples. And they eventually sacked basically the Hittites and other peoples. I think I've got a map showing you the actual Sea Peoples themselves, but there's a theory that they came out of somewhere in the southeastern part of Europe. And they attacked Greece, they attacked Turkey, they attacked Egypt as well. There's a lot of unknowns about it. They don't really know who they are. There's kind of a mystery, the so-called Sea Peoples. There's been all kinds of theories that the Sea Peoples were the Greeks, maybe like the ancient Greeks that would take over Greece, which are later called the Hellenes, you may have heard of. Another theory is that they were the Philistines. Another theory they were the Israelites. There's been another one. Of course, they could have been the Mycenaeans as well, but the Mycenaeans, I think, were already there at the time. I don't know about Minoans either. Then some people think it were the Trojans as well, which are in Turkey. And then there's another theory, too, which Herodotus claimed, that they were the Phrygians, who were like in the Balkans, which is where he thought they were from. the Phrygians will come in and take over part of Western Turkey, if you know about that. That's kind of who they were, but they actually sacked and destroyed Hattusa. It was like wiped out, the actual capital itself. And they even attacked, like I said, Egypt, and so much damage to Egypt that was done that it actually caused the New Kingdom to decline afterwards, which of course it would. So yeah, the Philistines maybe could have been them, but it's possible the Philistines, I think, were already there at the time, so likely probably not. So they don't really know who they were, the Sea Peoples. Now let me move on to the main thing today, of course, I'll get to, which is the Assyrian Empire, of course, which comes in and eventually takes over the whole political vacuum of Mesopotamia or ancient Iraq. A little bit about the Assyrian Empire. This was a state that emerged in mostly the northern part of Iraq today, based around the Tigris River, whereas Babylonia was more based around, the Euphrates River. And it's believed that the Assyrians went back to like the 21st century BC. They think that the Assyrians were kind of descended from the same people as the Babylonians, mostly Akkadian. And they often called that region Assyria, is the common term they used for the northern part of Iraq, whereas the southern part of Iraq was Babylonia. They have different periods of the Assyrian Empire. They have like the old and the middle Assyrian empires, which go back to like the Bronze Age, where the Assyrians starting out as a collection of city-states that form like a kingdom, and then you get down to like the Neo or New Assyrian Empire, which is more of an Iron Age state. That was a state that controlled not just Mesopotamia, but part of like Syria and also eventually part of Egypt, because that was one thing they were kind of famous for. It's one of the first states that kind of takes over part of Asia and Africa at the same time. The Assyrians, by the way, had a language that was well known. You may have heard of Aramaic. Aramaic was a type of Semitic language that they think evolved from Phoenician, like a Phoenician alphabet and language that the Phoenicians developed in Lebanon long time ago. And it's believed that a people called the Arameans that lived in Syria, like up in the upper part of the Euphrates Valley, developed the language initially, and then it spread to the Assyrians who began to use it. And Aramaic is important because it later influenced the rise of other alphabets like Hebrew and, of course, also Arabic as well. In fact, Aramaic and Hebrew are almost like identical. They almost look kind of similar, the actual languages. And today they still speak it. It's usually called Neo-Assyrian, or usually I think Assyriac, I think, is another term they use for it as well. And so a lot of people call it the Assyrian language, still being used. I think it's mostly Assyrian Christians that mostly still use that actual kind of language. Here's kind of a map showing like the peak of the Assyrian Empire. But at one point, they actually controlled from like where Iraq is all the way into Syria and Lebanon, Israel, and into Egypt. And at one point, you can see they did control part of like southern Turkey as well. So it was a massive empire, which I told you was one of the first that controlled part of Africa and Asia at the same time. And got some images right here you're looking at. One thing about the Assyrians, they're very warlike. In fact, they had one of the first great militaries in history. If you study about ancient times of that period, and they really had one of the first major Iron Age armies, which were copied by everybody else, like the Persians that came in later, the Greeks and the Romans, etc. Almost were like copying, about the Assyrian Empire and their military. And they used a lot of men. They mass conscripted a lot of men into their armies, etc. And they had different capitals, by the way. Ashur, if you go back to that map, right there, Ashur, spelled either Ashur or A-S-S-U-R, A-S-S-U-R, spelled either way. Asher is how they say it. And by the way, they also say Assyrian, if you know about that. Assyrian is how they actually usually say it in the Middle East. In the West, they say Assyrian, you know about that. But that was their early capital in the Bronze Age. And then by the Iron Age, it switched to another capital along the Tigris, upper Tigris up there, Nineveh, which I'll talk about a little later about that. But their armies were really good. They had like kind of a list of things that they had in their military, but they had like an armored cavalry, like mail type cavalry. They had supply depots where they could supply their forces, like in battle or during a war. Transport columns they were one of the first to do that, where the Syrians used camels to like move stuff around, like supplies for their forces. Corps of engineers, which is true about that, who built roads, they built bridges, siege towers to take, cities, different kinds of weaponry, built, chariots, etc. Also built things like battering rams and stuff like that, were other things that I guess engineers also built as well. And one thing that's very famous about the Assyrian Empire, it was actually the first empire to build like a road system, like throughout their empire. I don't know if they know exactly how long the road system was, but it was a type of road system that was copied by other people, Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, and so on. So they are masters of siege warfare, taking like large-sized cities and things like that. And that's part of why they were known for being, great conquerors. They were also cruel conquerors. When they would take like a city in different states, they would take all the population, like the best people, and they would bring them back to Assyria, where they would use them like as slaves. They would take all the men and conscript them into the Syrian military and stuff like that. And so they used all these peoples to better their empire. So that's why they're kind of considered cruel, because of what they did to other people. I guess they took all the best looking women, brought them all back, and stuff like that. And so a lot of that's mentioned in the Bible. Like I know in the Bible, like in the Old Testament, there's a lot of stories where they talk bad about the Assyrians, like the Israelites hated them, stuff like that. So let's kind of just talk about Assyrian military tactics and how they would take a city. They usually laid siege to it and starve them out. And then that didn't work. They would then bring up siege towers, siege equipment, battering rams, and then take the city from the inside. And then if there was a king of that city or whatever, they would take him and just usually have him killed, is what they would do. So it's like quite common, like Assyrians, like the people that are left over, they just had them killed, that kind of thing, or cut their tongues out and stuff like that. Everybody did that back then, though. Here's another map showing also the deportations, where people were deported back to, of course, Assyria. The most famous that was deported, if you know about the Assyrians, is a lot of the Israelites, like the tribes. They were all brought back to Assyria, which most of that was done, I guess, between the 9th and the 8th centuries. They think that that was like the so-called lost tribes of Israel, that they sometimes call it, by the way, is usually what they dub that, etc. So here's, of course, also some other images. That is the kind of some ruins of Asher, by the way, which they think may have been founded close to about the 19th or 20th century. So that's how far the city goes back. So a long, long time ago, that was their original city and capital that the Assyrians, I guess where their name comes from. So I guess Assyrian or Ashurian means the people of Asher, I guess would be what it is. They do think it started out as a small city and city-state, and then over time it became a kingdom and empire as it grew in northern Iraq. Later, they had another state, you can see, city excuse me, that was called Nineveh, which was really their greatest city. Nineveh will later be the capital of what is the new or neo-Assyrian Empire. That was their peak period, really, as a state, which that particular empire peaked between the 10th and the 7th centuries BC, when it was around as a state. And the ruins of Nineveh today are located where Mosul is. Mosul, Iraq, which is in northern Iraq today, located on the east bank, of course, of the Tigris River. You can see with that. Yeah, here's some images, of course, of the ruins of Nineveh, which some of that's probably been rebuilt. That's like one of the gates into the city of Nineveh. They do think that Nineveh at one point may have been one of the largest cities in the world, like before Babylon peaked under King Nebuchadnezzar II. But I know under a lot of the Assyrian rulers, that like around the 7th century, they think that the population may have got up to like as much as 150,000. So we're talking about an area that may have been 2,000 acres in size, size-wise overall, which is maybe a little smaller than what Babylon will get to eventually under Nebuchadnezzar II. It's not really that big on Hammurabi. It's smaller, They think that the capital itself was first constructed by King Sennacherib, who's mentioned in the Old Testament. They think that maybe around 700 BC is about when the capital is starting to be constructed and being moved to there from, I guess, Ashur, more from the south to the north. But I think there's some stats. They say that that Nineveh may have been something like the walls that were built there were supposedly 60, 70 feet tall. That's the story about Nineveh. And it may have been several square miles, of course, in size as well. I think I've got, let me see. Yeah, there's another image right there, kind of basically the gate, one of the gates that's there. I think they have some walls that have kind of been rebuilt too, that are also at that site. But let me talk about religion a little bit, like some of the different gods that the Assyrians believed in. The Assyrians had different gods, which some of these have been incorporated from other cultures before them, like going back to Sumerian times. And one of their chief gods that they worshiped initially was a god called Ashur, which you see on the right there. Ashur was this Assyrian war god that was famous for looking like it's actually a man in a chariot, like a soldier in a chariot with wings. Basically, he's got a composite bow he's holding. And so that image there kind of shows you how the Assyrians were very warlike as a people. And so everything was based around kind of a military society in their empire. Other gods that were kind of popular, also Ishtar, which they think Ishtar, I mentioned before, was a type of god that was incorporated from the Sumerian culture like a long time ago. That's her on the left, and she was predominantly a fertility goddess, which I think was also associated with things like alcohol and brewing, and I think also like things like love and procreation, kind of like Aphrodite or something like that, and maybe Isis. I think that's where those came from, like the gods Isis and like I told you, the goddess Aphrodite. They think that may have evolved from Idana or Ishtar over time. And she was known as the Queen of Heaven. That was one of her nicknames that she was called. Another goddess, which is also kind of famous, you may have heard of, is Lamassu or Lama, I think they call her also as well, which is very popular. And that's the goddess you sometimes see, which is like a bull with wings. That's kind of interesting. See a lot of these statues throughout Mesopotamia and Iraq. And it was supposed to be kind of considered like a protector type god that was kind of famous. I think I've got another image showing Lamassu type statues that are kind of well known. Let me talk about a few rulers that were also powerful as well. Tiglath-Pileser III, he's a ruler that kind of reigns in the 8th century. That should be 745 to 772, I think is actual. I think those are kind of messed up. That should be 745 to 727. That should be the dates right there, BC. But he's considered one of the most powerful rulers of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, which the Neo-Assyrian Empire, they think, goes back to they think it started in the early 10th century. I think usually 911 has been sometimes a date, or 912. It's about when they think it started. And it goes for about 300 years. So I think 911, 912, and about maybe 612 or somewhere around there is about the dates of it usually. And they think under him, when he begins to incorporate it into like a large size empire. And the thing he was known for was expanding it. He expanded the empire mostly to the west, like into where Israel and Syria is what he was kind of known for. And they think he's the one that kind of really developed a lot of the military that the Assyrians are kind of famous for later. He had a bunch of sons that were famous. Shalmaneser V, who I think reigned just briefly. And then he had a well-known son, probably the most famous ruler of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, which was Sargon II, which I'll mostly talk about. But here you kind of see a map showing you some of the expansion of the Assyrian Empire, which Tiglath-Pileser III, he was the one that was instrumental in really expanding the empire first to the west into Syria and part of Israel. Also Babylon. I think there was another thing too that happened under his reign in the 8th century, is that the Assyrians pushed down into southern Iraq and they took over Babylon. So all that's going to be absorbed, of course, into their empire. And most of Israel would be taken over by them, except the kingdom of Judah, which kind of survived, though. Another great ruler, I told you, of course, probably the most famous one, Sargon II. So it's around his time that the capital of Nineveh is going to be moved eventually, to like, it's going to be moved to Nineveh, of course, under his empire. They think under him and Sennacherib and a few other rulers is like the peak size of the whole Assyrian Empire as a power. And his conquests include part of also Syria and Israel as well, and Babylon. So all that's kind of being incorporated into a large size empire under him. He's also got a lot of relatives that were also famous kings of Assyria. Sennacherib, who really is the one that begins building Nineveh, their capital. And then he has also got a grandson named Esarhaddon that's well known. And I think they even mentioned the Bible, especially Sennacherib. But yeah, he starts a dynasty, which is true. If you go back, they do have a dynasty, which I thought I had a list of kings. I don't know if I have a list of kings. I guess I don't. But the dynasty of kings were called the Sargonid dynasty. That's what they dub it usually. And it goes from 722, is about when it started, and then it goes to 609. So it roughly lasts a little over 100 years that it's in power. And it's really the most famous dynasty of the Assyrians that they have. And it has like 7 kings in it that they have, which Sargon II, I think, Sennacherib, and I think there's another ruler, of course, Ashurbanipal, we'll talk about too, were probably the most famous rulers that were really, really in it. That was when I was going to get to, of course. You have Ashurbanipal, who reigned in the 7th century BC. He's the 4th king of the Sargonid dynasty of these Assyrian rulers of the Neo-Assyrian period. And he's really considered to be one of the last great kings that they have of the Assyrians. Because after he dies, the empire is going to start declining afterwards. They think it's under him when their empire peaks in size. So you can see they controlled lands up to that point in the 7th century. They control like Assyria, Babylonia, the area of Israel, Lebanon, Syria, pretty much controlled. They do take over Egypt, which is true about that. They do control parts of like southern Turkey and western Iran also as well. Ashurbanipal is very famous for, you see kind of another map showing you like kind of how big their empire stretching down into, of course, Egypt right there. But he was famous for a library he constructed called the Royal Library of Ashurbanipal, which they think was part of his palace complex that was built at Nineveh. And it was very famous for housing a lot of cuneiform tablets, which I think numbered in the thousands. I think it has as a number right here if you want, which might be 30,000 tablets that they think may have been contained at one point. And it had a lot of, information about the Mesopotamian world that I guess had been unknown at the time, including the most complete version of the Epic of Gilgamesh was actually discovered within the ruins. And it wasn't really until the 19th century that archaeologists came to the ruins of Nineveh and began excavating it. And one of the men that did that was a man named Austin Henry Layard. You may have heard of, who was a British archaeologist. And he was the one that really began a lot of the excavations of it. But they do think that the library itself may have influenced others. I think there's a theory that Alexander the Great may have seen it and decided to create his own library in Egypt. And that led to the Library of Alexandria being built afterwards. So that's they theorize about that. But it was actually part of his palace complex, Ashurbanipal. What happened, though, his empire declined. Later, they have this rebellion that breaks out within his empire, where people in the southern part called the Chaldeans or Chaldees rebel because I guess they're sick of Assyrian rule from the north. And so they rebel against them, and eventually the Assyrian forces are defeated in 612 BC. There's a famous battle called the Battle of Nineveh, well known in history, where the Chaldean forces, who were aided by people in Iran, the Scythians and also the Medes, which were part of the Kingdom of Media, which was like both those were in northern Iran, there, later Persia. And they helped basically the Chaldeans defeat the Assyrians. And of course, what happened to Nineveh? Nineveh was sacked and destroyed. And the whole city was wiped out, a lot of the people. And so nobody ever lived there afterwards. So today, like I said, the ruins of Nineveh are, like I said, based where the city of Mosul is in northern Iraq. So now, out of the ruins of what was left, I guess, of Mesopotamia, you get this new state that comes about, which it's called, you can see there, the neo-babylonian empire is what they call it, or also they call it the either new or neo. It's called either one, basically. And it's an empire that's mostly in Mesopotamia and Syria, and also part of where northern Iraq is. Iraq, Syria, maybe at Israel, kind of absorbed into it at one point. And it actually was founded by this king named King Nabopolassar, who, by the way, was the father of King Nebuchadnezzar II, who comes in late. I think there were two Nebuchadnezzar rulers, I think, at one point of Mesopotamia. And who are these people that actually that took it over? They were actually settled by these people, taken over by people that are called the Chaldees or Chaldeans, they were called. And the Chaldeans were a type of Semitic people that kind of came from that region. I think there's a debate about where they're from, like the origins of the Chaldeans. Some people think they may have come from like close to like where the Persian Gulf is, and settled in southern Iraq, but they're not related to the Babylonians of Hammurabi's time. In fact, this is like 1,000 years later when this state came about. One thing about it, it's one of the last Semitic states to really reign over Mesopotamia, which it is, and it wasn't around very long. You see, 626 to about 539 BC was about how long that actual state existed. And then after that, all the states that control Mesopotamia are non-Semitic. That control that pretty much like, I guess, Aryan or Indo-European or whatever that take it over. Why do they call it neo-Babylonian or new Babylonian? It's because Babylon becomes the center of power in Mesopotamia again. It hadn't been like that way since Hammurabi's time, and so they call it new or neo-Babylonian. I think they do it to also differentiate between Hammurabi's state and Nebuchadnezzar's state, and so people don't confuse it. But like I said, it's like 1,000 years apart when the two empires existed. Here, of course, image of Nebuchadnezzar. You're looking at Nebuchadnezzar, of course, like I said, was their greatest ruler. He's the one that rebuilt Babylon, which it became, like I said, the center and capital of this particular new short-lived empire that was there. They also call it the Chaldean Empire, if you want to call it that, as well. And he was famous for reconstructing the city, which I told you, like I said, Babylon at that time became the largest city in the world, like maybe 200,000 people it had. And I think I told you it was like 4 or 5 square miles or something like that was the size of the city. And he was famous for his building projects, like building a lot of different ziggurats and temples. He built a lot of the fortifications of also Babylon, built the Ishtar Gate, and then he also built as well a lot of the main walls. I guess because it was supposed to be a walled city that was built around the whole thing. Let me show you some images. Of course, they always talk about the Ishtar Gate, which, I told you the Ishtar Gate is kind of where they get the term Babylon from, because Babylon, I told you, meant gate of God, or gate or door of the God, basically. Wasn't the only gate they had. I think they had multiple gates. Probably had 7 or 8 they may have had. But that was the most famous gate that was built into it, entrance into it. And the Ishtar Gate was a gate that honored mostly the goddess Ishtar, but I think it was also honored the god Marduk as well, which was the god of Babylon, their main civic deity. Here's other images of it, of course. That's actually a replica of the Ishtar Gate, which is at the ruins of Babylon today in Iraq, of course. The original gate actually is not in it's not in Iraq. It's actually in Germany, believe it or not. Apparently, German archaeologists back in the 20th century dismantled the original gate and they brought it to Germany, where it's now in this museum in Berlin called the Pergamon Museum, which is kind of controversial. I'm sure they want their gate back, that kind of thing. But that's the original gate, of course, you're looking at. And it has like bulls and I think dragons on it. Something. It's usually got kind of course, a bluish color to it, you see with the brick. Of course, the other thing he built that's very famous, I think I've mentioned about it before, is Entemenanke, which Entemenanke was considered the largest ziggurat ever constructed in ancient Mesopotamia. And this, like a step pyramid, was a mud brick structure that was built, by the way, to honor the god Marduk. I told you about Marduk, which was the Babylonian god of magic and water. And it's supposed he had a huge statue of that god in the actual temple that was there. And there's kind of debate about how tall it was, but I know they think from statistics on the actual, I think from the Bible, they've been able to figure out maybe that it may have been about 50 cubits tall, which would be somewhere between 70 and 80 feet tall. And they think that the sides of it may have been equivalent to it, like maybe all around. And so they think it was the largest one ever built. They do think it was real because they actually, if you look at Google Earth, like on the left, they actually have the bottom of it still there, like the base of it, of where they think Entemenanke was at one point. And that's a kind of a drawing of what they think it may have looked like at one point. It later collapsed in Entemenanke. Of course, the other thing that's very famous that Nebuchadnezzar is well known for is the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, which they think he constructed during his reign. And Hanging Gardens of Babylon, it's not actually mentioned in the Bible. That's what's one interesting one thing about it. It's actually mentioned by Greco-Roman sources predominantly. I think the two main sources are Josephus, who mentions it close to about the first century AD. And then I think there was another author before him named Diodorus of Sicily in the first century BC, also mentioned it as well. And if you know about it, it was one of the Greeks' seven wonders of the world. That it was considered some of the greatest monuments ever constructed in ancient history. And it was built on the east bank of the Euphrates River. You can see it's kind of debate about how tall it was. Some people claim it was, about maybe that tall or whatever, 70, 80 feet tall or something like that. May have been kind of equivalent to the. Actually, I think in Timonaki may have been taller, that kind of thing. They're not sure about that, how tall it was, but they do think it was built for his wife. He was a queen who was originally a princess from Media, the kingdom of Media, northern Iran. She had come from a mountainous region, and so he built this lavish palace for her, Hanging Gardens of Babylon. And it was called that because of the fact it had all these greenery of trees that were constructed on it. And it had mechanical waterfalls on top of it that actually fell down. But over time, it collapsed, they think. Of course, I was talking about Saddam Hussein. Yeah, he's done a lot to kind of try and rebuild Babylon, which I think they say he spent something like $500 million. Like I think it was like $500 million in trying to reconstruct it. Which, if you look at this image, which is right here, so it's kind of controversial to him trying to reconstruct it, but he did kind of try to rebuild some of the palace complex of actual Nebuchadnezzar. That you're looking at right there. So never really completed this rebuilding projects, which mostly I think he started in the 1990s when he tried to do this. Here's kind of an aerial view of what he was trying to do with rebuilding it. So yeah, it is kind of controversial, but that's kind of interesting about Saddam, how he's kind of big into antiquities and trying to protect, Iraq's ancient heritage, that kind of thing. But I think a lot of it was also to kind of boost his power and stuff like that by using the past. Of course, some other things that he's also well known for, Nebuchadnezzar, that you always hear about. He's very famous for sacking Jerusalem, what was the state of the kingdom of Judah, which we'll talk about more later about that. But in the early 6th century, basically Judah got laid siege to for something like 2 or 3 years by Nebuchadnezzar's forces. And the city was destroyed, a lot of it. And so the people, like the actual Jews from the kingdom of Judah, a lot of them were forced into captivity. They were actually brought back to what is Babylonia in the capital of Babylon, where they remained captive for several decades, to I think close to about 539 BC. And so it's kind of considered kind of a tragic period in Jewish history, but they do think it's kind of important later because they think that the Babylonian captivity had a major influence on the Jewish faith, also on a lot of the books of the Old Testament that start to kind of get written afterwards because of that. Yeah, and of course, there's a lot of books of the Bible, the Old Testament, that mention, of course, about Nebuchadnezzar's reign. The most famous is the book of Daniel. You've heard about the prophet Daniel, of course, named after Daniel, where my name comes from. One of my favorite stories, Daniel Lion's Den, that kind of thing. But he was one of those citizens that was forced into captivity, that lived under Nebuchadnezzar's reign, and of course, he wrote about it. About his life there and so on. But there's other books too Book of Kings, Book of Chronicles, Book of Jeremiah. Also, I think maybe also the Book of Ezekiel, I think also mentions Nebuchadnezzar. And so Nebuchadnezzar is like a really famous, ruler. He may have been one of the most powerful rulers at that time, not just in Mesopotamia, but maybe in the world overall. What happened to this particular empire, the Neo-Babylonian Empire? Well, it declined after Nebuchadnezzar died. There was like a couple rulers that reigned afterwards, like mostly his sons, and it was ineffective. But what happened was they had another power that was bigger than them, which was the Persian Empire. And the Persian Empire, which came in from Iran, conquered basically Mesopotamia. They also conquered pretty much the rest of the world. I'll kind of show you right here in the Near East. But you can see here, Persia, which is based in Iran, their empire, they would basically absorb most of that region. Turkey was taken next. Then they took over Mesopotamia. Then they took over Syria, Israel area. And then you can see they absorbed also Egypt as well into it. So that'll be eventually one of the largest empires that'll kind of form afterwards. That'll last for something like 2 centuries. That the Persian Empire. It's also called the Achaemenid Empire, is the other common name that they called it. They end that particular state about 539 BC and then absorb all that area. I'll talk about the Persians later. I usually kind of get to them when I get to the Greeks more than anything. But Cyrus the Great was one of the founders of it, one of their great kings. So that's pretty much the main history, of course, of ancient Mesopotamia. Of course, they do have other periods afterwards where Mesopotamia is mostly, controlled by other powers, which, like I told you, most of the powers that come in later are primarily non-Semitic. These are peoples that are like either Indo-Aryans, like the Persians from Iran, or you get like the Greeks and the Romans, like Alexander the Great conquers that area. The Romans conquer it. Ottoman Empire, at one point, controlled it. But none of those peoples were Semitic that, controlled those basic states. I don't think I have any comments. It looks like I did have a few students I know that came in late. Hey, Geraldine, what's going on? And of course, Elise also joined us too as well. And then Sierra also, of course, as well. Sorry I didn't get to y'all, of course, till later. Before I go, I did want to talk about a few reminders that are important. We do have a new quiz coming up, of course, which is the Mesopotamia quiz, which I'm, of course, posting in Canvas quizzes today. Should be posted pretty much this morning. If you want to start working on it today, you can. It'll be due later in the semester. Looks like more into early February. It's when it'll be due. But primarily, we have now 2 quizzes to do, which is the one on prehistory and the one on Mesopotamia as well. So that's pretty much it for today's lecture. Next week, I'm going to move on to talk about ancient Egypt. I'll kind of get into like the background of the great Egyptian civilization. I'll talk about some of their states like the Old Kingdom. We'll talk about pyramids, something that they're very famous for and all that. But don't forget, if you have a question, about the class, you can, of course, email me anytime you want. Also, don't forget, you can leave comments, questions about the class in, I think I told you, Canvas discussions. You can also leave comments, questions, of course, on the actual lectures on YouTube also. So that's pretty much it today. Y'all take care. Y'all have, by the way, hey, Sean, y'all, of course, have a great weekend coming up also as well. So y'all take care and have a great one.